lobbyists to create and then sell their escape plan.
Well, put yourself in the position of someone who's got pieces of asbestos lodged in his or her lung because they worked with the product, a product that made a big profit over all the years since 1920 for James Hardie. And the company's given every impression of vanishing in a puff of smoke to escape liability.
They used to call this building Asbestos House, but by early 2001, the offending word was gone. The company's power brokers were working frantically on a deal they called the Ultimate Resolution, a scheme to cut off James Hardie once and for all from its killer product. The first step, creating a foundation for asbestos victims, the vehicle they'd leave behind when they executed their plan to move offshore.
My office was told in February 2001 that they were setting up the foundation. And of course, there wasn't the faintest signal or indication that they were going to restructure their corporate affairs and go offshore. If they'd said that, or even hinted at that, there would have been alarm bells ringing.
Above all, Hardie's wanted to avoid setting off those alarm bells. The board had paid big PR companies for advice, and their first recommendation was simple.
Attract as little attention as possible.
The CEO, Peter MacDonald, had set a time horizon, a strict deadline to be met in order to bury the news of the company's rebirth.
There was an air of urgency which was self-created. They wanted to announce the foundation at a time they were announcing their third quarter results, and that would be a good way to keep it a business story and out of the front end of the newspaper.
The transaction was complex, but the idea behind it simple enough. Almost all of Hardie's victims get sick from products made from two of its subsidiaries, James Hardie and Company and Hardie Ferodo Brakes. The plan was to take those two companies and their assets and put them lock, stock and barrel into a trust fund, creating a pool of money to pay out existing asbestos victims and new ones in the future. The reborn James Hardie would be squeaky clean and asbestos-free, a much better prospect for investors. Involved that evening, either directly or by phone, with the main cast and supporting players, whose actions are now being scrutinised by the New South Wales Inquiry. The two key James Hardie men, CEO Peter MacDonald and his chief counsel Peter Shafron. They're hired guns from Sydney's leading law firm Allens, David Robb and Peter Cameron. Also present, the four men Hardie's had chosen to run the new fund, including Chairman Sir Lou Edwards. The new directors found the events of the evening confusing. After midnight, they saw for the first time the indemnity document that took away their right to sue James Hardie if they ever needed more money for victims.
They shouldn't have blindly accepted what was put to them by the company, and that even the most basic questions would have revealed holes in the reports that were provided to them.
Whatever sins may be visited upon them pale into insignificance compared to the very active, deliberate misrepresentations which were made to them in relation to this fund.
The fund's directors were certainly kept in the dark about one of the most critical facts. Hours earlier, Allen's lawyer David Robb was reviewing the so-called Trowbridge report. Trowbridge are the actuaries who use data given to them by James Hardie to predict the cost of future asbestos claims.
Trowbridge report is very important because it is something that is relied upon by Hardie's to say, well, we obtained expert actuarial advice. The underlying assumptions of that report were wrong, and the management of James Hardie knew they were wrong.
Rob learnt that the last 9 months of claim figures were not there.
That data showed an increase in claims and an increase in the average payment of claims.
The missing data put a huge question mark over Trowbridge's predictions and whether the fund would have enough money to compensate future victims. Concerned, Rob spoke to Hardie's chief counsel, Peter Shafron. Shafron was blunt. The missing figures didn't matter. Rob wasn't satisfied. He and senior partner Peter Cameron rang Saffron's boss, Peter MacDonald.
He had been contacted again by his own lawyers on the day of the transaction, apparently in a state of some alarm, because the lawyers had just found out that the last 9 months of data had been withheld. They pressed him, apparently, on a couple of occasions in that conversation as to whether they ought to proceed, and he instructed them to proceed.
Day breaks over Sydney's CBD. The marathon meeting is over. In 9 hours, no mention was made to the incoming directors of the missing data. James Hardie's asbestos-producing subsidiaries were no longer part of the company. Step one was complete.
Good morning. Welcome to everyone present and those on the conference call.
A few hours later, Hardie's CEO Peter MacDonald announced the creation of the new fund.
So today, James Hardie has effectively resolved its asbestos liability to the mutual benefit of both its shareholders and future claimants, current and future claimants, as a result of asbestos injuries.
Following the board's communication strategy, the announcement was buried in a routine business briefing to avoid scrutiny by the general media. As the strategy notes,
If we did it in mid-January, there'd be too many journalists chasing too few stories and a higher risk that the trust would become a hot story.
Investors will also be able to look at the company as the company that it is now and not be concerned about asbestos tails. James Hardie will therefore, in our view, become more attractive to investors.
the key message was that the fund had enough money to look after all of James Hardie's victims.
The foundation is fully funded as of today. The foundation is fully funded, but of course the foundation is fully funded. So
Since it's now estimated the fund is short by as much as $2 billion, Peter MacDonald could face fraud charges if prosecutors decide he knew his statements were false. Hardie's executives followed up the presentation with phone calls to reassure the so-called stakeholders, including Hardie's traditional enemies, the plaintiff lawyers.
They told me the amount of the figure, and I can remember, putting the phone down, and the first thought that I had was, that just can't be enough money. I didn't appreciate at all why they were ringing me until I read the communications and the risk strategies that were in the board papers of 15 February 2001, and then I now appreciate that I wasn't special at all. I was just one of a whole lot of people that they rang up and in an effort to ensure that any critical comment might be neutralised.
This is all part of the sort of modern apparatus and what this sort of piranha pool of PR and spin doctors, spend their time preying on, basically, that there are all these stakeholders to be stroked and they're out there doing it. This is what commissions are terrific at. They scratch back the gloss a bit and there's a festering smell there.
Hardie's employed two sets of spin doctors. Gavin Anderson to lobby the federal government, but more importantly, Hawker Britton to work on the New South Wales Labor government. Bruce Hawker and David Britton used to work for Bob Carr. They gave the James Hardie board detailed analysis of the main players and threats in Labor circles.
Bob Carr, pro-business, would be influenced by unions and public opinion if it created political exposure.
That's absolutely fair. Absolutely fair.
It's not a flattering portrait, though, is it? It suggests you're more sensitive to political risk than you are to the rights of victims.
No, but they're a group of lobbyists. They've got no more claim to insight than other lobbyists.
That PR firm did have special insight into your government. Hawker Britton came out of your office.
Yeah, I'm not
didn't
arguing
they?
with their shorthand description. I'm concerned about the reputation of the government. But there was nothing in what they presented. There are no alarm bells ringing for members of the Foundation, for the Supreme Court, for the financial press, or above all for the federal government, which has the corporation's power.